My name is Eleanor Hartman. I'm an 80-year-old sculptor, widow mother, and as I've come to realize, a woman who's been living under a dangerous illusion. The truth began to crack open on the evening of my birthday inside my own home, surrounded by people who smiled with false warmth. The living room had been transformed with soft golden lights and white roses, my favorite, or at least they had been decades ago. I stood near the fireplace, accepting gentle hugs and small talk from old friends and art patrons who still referred to me as a legend. Patrick, my only child, had orchestrated the entire event with the kind of meticulous charm that impressed outsiders and unsettled me in private. He insisted we celebrate big this year. 80, after all, felt like a final chapter to him. I brushed off the thought, blaming it on fatigue, even though the ache in my joints and the heaviness in my chest had become impossible to ignore. A part of me wondered if I really was nearing the end, but that night, I learned someone else hoped I was. I left the crowd for a moment to steady myself. The noise felt louder than usual, the lights a bit too bright. I moved slowly through the hallway toward the powder room, gripping the wall with my left hand while balancing the weight of my body with each step. I had nearly reached the door when I heard voices from the den, Patrick and his wife, Danielle. Their laughter was quiet, but the words that followed sliced through the warmth of the party like a blade. If all goes well, this should be her last birthday. My breath caught. The room tilted slightly. I leaned against the wall to stay upright, afraid my knees would give out. Danielle's voice was calm, even rehearsed. She mentioned a property appraiser coming next week. Something about converting the art studio into a walk-in closet. Patrick responded with that familiar, smooth tone. He spoke of my heart condition and how the latest medication had made me foggier, more docile. He said it was almost time to call the lawyer. His voice didn't waver. They clinked glasses. I stood there frozen as the floor under me ceased to feel real. My body responded with the kind of precision I'd trained into it for decades. I straightened, took a deep breath, and smoothed my skirt. I walked back to the party like I had heard nothing. The faces blurred as I rejoined the celebration. Someone handed me a glass of champagne. I smiled and nodded at compliments about my last gallery show. Every gesture felt mechanical, like I was moving through someone else's life. Patrick raised his glass to toast me, to the woman who taught him the meaning of hard work, to his mother, the artist, the pioneer. I looked into his eyes and saw not love, but calculation. As applause rang out, I sipped my drink and let the mask settle fully onto my face. I smiled at Danielle as she leaned over to compliment the cake. Her voice was light, playful, and rehearsed. I realized then that I had been living among actors. The roles they played so well were written behind my back. Back in my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed without removing my shoes. The heels had pinched all evening, but I barely noticed. I stared at the wall for a long time, running the scene over and over. Her words, his response, the tone of quiet certainty. This should be her last birthday. It echoed like a line from a script they had both agreed to long ago. Not a wish, a plan. And I foolishly had given them every tool they needed. My trust, my home, my declining health, my signature on every document Patrick had ever slid in front of me. The ceiling fan whirred above, pushing warm air down toward my chest. I reached for the carved walnut box on my dresser, one of the few pieces left untouched by Danielle's redecorating. Inside were old photos, newspaper clippings, and sketches of sculptures that never made it past my work table. I found a photo of Patrick at 10 years old, holding a piece of clay I had helped him mold. His smile was crooked, proud, and genuine. I stared at it until my eyes burned. Somewhere along the way, the boy I raised had turned into a man I couldn't recognize, and now that man was waiting for me to die. I turned off the lamp and lay back fully dressed, the photo still in my hand. Sleep didn't come, only resolve, something deep and quiet like the beginning of a sculpture. The rough shape of an idea was forming inside me. I would not die quietly. I would not let them steal my ending. This story wasn't over. Not yet. In the quiet hours after the party, I started retracing the steps that had brought me here. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Just small gestures from a concerned son trying to help his aging mother. But once I began to look closely, the pattern unfolded like a map I hadn't realized I'd drawn. It began after George died. I was drowning in paperwork grief and a house that felt too large and too silent. Patrick offered to help sort through the insurance, the bills, and the health plans I never fully understood. I was grateful. He showed up with a laptop and soft tone, guiding me through account logins and insurance forms I didn't have the energy to question. I let him. He said my longtime doctor was too old-fashioned, that I needed someone who specialized in geriatric cardiology. I resisted at first, but he was so persistent, so sure. The new doctor was a friend of his, and he arranged everything. My prescriptions changed soon after. At first I noticed no difference. Then came the fog, the tremors, the days I couldn't remember if I had already eaten breakfast. Patrick said aging did that to people. I believed him. He started managing my pillbox, claiming it was safer that way. Then he offered to help with the bank because the online systems confused me. Eventually, I let him sign on to my accounts. He told me not to worry about the little things. I was still sculpting then, though less than before. I blamed the stiffness in my hands on arthritis, the lapses in focus on mourning, not the pills he handed me every morning. He had a way of making suggestions sound like favors. Just until you feel more stable, Mum. I remember the exact tone. Warm, reasonable, just enough concern to quiet my doubts. He moved some of my artwork into storage, saying it was for safekeeping. Danielle started redecorating slowly, one room at a time, until I barely recognized the home I had lived in for 4 decades. She told me it was time for a fresher look. Looking back now, every choice I thought I made freely had been guided by invisible strings. Patrick didn't take control overnight. He made it feel like I handed it to him piece by piece. It's the cleverness that makes it worse. The manipulation was wrapped in care, delivered in small doses like the pills. He made dependency feel like love, and I didn't see it until it was almost too late. The morning after the party, I waited until the house had settled into its usual weekday rhythm. Patrick had left early for the office. Danielle was at the gym, or at least she said she was. That left me and Nia as it had for nearly 30 years. She brought in my tea, as she always did, placing the tray gently on the side table. I watched her for a moment, the way she adjusted the curtains to let in just enough light, how she checked the edges of the rug for any folds I might trip on. She had been in this house longer than Patrick's marriage, and was more loyal than most people I knew. I said her name softly and she turned. Her expression shifted the moment she saw my face. I told her I needed to speak with her in private. Something terrible. She sat beside me on the couch, her hands folded. I expected disbelief, maybe concern. But as I described what I'd overheard and the changes I'd started piecing together, I saw something else in her eyes. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. She'd been keeping track of everything. The labels on the pill bottles didn't match. The nights I'd seemed more confused. The times Patrick had swapped prescriptions while saying it was just a refill. She hadn't wanted to interfere without proof. She was afraid of being dismissed, or worse, fired. But she'd seen enough to know something was wrong. I felt the tears gather before I could stop them. Not from sadness. From relief. From not being alone in this anymore. She put her hand on mine and told me I wasn't crazy. That she believed me. That she had for some time. I asked her for help. Not just to observe, but to act. To protect me. She nodded without hesitation. I've got you, Miss Eleanor. Always have. Always will. We spoke in whispers for the rest of the morning, outlining what we needed. A new phone, a second opinion, somewhere safe to keep records. She offered ideas I hadn't even considered. For the first time in months, maybe longer, I felt my spine straighten. Not because the dizziness had lifted, but because something stronger had settled in its place. Resolve. With Nia beside me, I wasn't just an old woman being slowly erased. I was a woman preparing to fight back. Nia drove me to the clinic on a rainy Tuesday morning. We used a car-sharing app and wore plain clothes, taking every precaution to avoid attention. My name wasn't listed on the appointment, and the receptionist greeted us with a code word arranged days before. Dr. Simon Hughes had been my physician for nearly 25 years before Patrick convinced me to switch. He had retired from full-time practice, but still took on a few private clients. When I walked into the room, his expression shifted from confusion to deep concern. He ran every test available: physical reflexes, blood panels, heart stress evaluations. When he sat across from me, his face was grave but not panicked. My heart was strong, surprisingly strong for a woman my age. What wasn't strong was everything else: the tremors, the confusion, the fatigue. All of it pointed not to aging, but to chemical interference, drug combinations that shouldn't coexist, medications designed to slow the mind and stress the body. He asked who was managing my prescriptions now. I didn't answer at first. I think part of me still hoped he'd say it was all a misunderstanding, that maybe I'd imagined too much. But when he pointed to a specific drug in my chart and explained its effects on cognition and heart rhythm, something in me snapped into place. Not fear, not shocking, but something harder, a locked-in feeling like a puzzle finally solved. He paused and waited for my reaction. I sat very still. Rage isn't always loud. Sometimes it sits in your throat like ice. I told him I believed I was being poisoned, that the pills were being switched, that my own son might be involved. He didn't flinch. He just nodded and said we'd need to act carefully. He couldn't confront anyone yet, not until I had legal protections and independent verification, but he promised to help, quietly, thoroughly. Before I left, he handed me a folder of his notes. I tucked them into my coat like they were made of glass. Nia was waiting in the lobby. I didn't need to say anything. She saw it in my eyes. In that moment, everything shifted. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't doubting myself. I had a diagnosis. I had the truth. And now I had a reason to fight. The first call I made after my diagnosis was to a lawyer named Celeste Moran. She'd helped me negotiate gallery contracts years ago and had a reputation for being both ruthless and discreet. When I told her what I suspected, she didn't gasp or doubt. She listened. Then she asked how far I wanted to go. I told her I wanted every decision moving forward to be legal, strategic, and irreversible. Nothing dramatic. No confrontations. Just control, quietly reclaimed. We began with a foundation. I had always dreamed of funding a program for young sculptors, but never thought I'd build it out of necessity. Celeste helped me create the Hartman Fund for emerging artists. My house, my studio, my savings, even my personal collection, all of it was quietly transferred. On paper, I was a benefactor nearing the end of life, preserving a legacy. In reality, I was taking everything Patrick had been counting on and locking it behind doors he didn't even know existed. While Celeste handled the legal side, I reached out to Martin Ridge, an old friend who now specializes in estate realty and asset shielding. He'd known George, my late husband, and he'd always admired the way I managed our finances after his passing. I didn't tell him the whole story just enough. He offered his expertise and connections. By the end of the week, my property had been reassessed under new parameters that made it nearly untouchable in a standard probate scenario. I maintained the routine Patrick expected. I took the pills, but never swallowed. I let my hands shake when he looked at me and stumbled just enough on words to keep his confidence high. Meanwhile, Nia and I documented everything. We kept a duplicate record off-site and a hidden camera system installed by a former student who now worked in tech security. The more I planned, the stronger I felt. It was like sketching a sculpture in reverse. Instead of building up from clay, I was carving away the illusion that had imprisoned me. Bit by bit, I became more alert, more deliberate. Patrick noticed the shift. He asked if I felt better. I said it was just a good week. He smiled, satisfied. He had no idea the house he stood in the studio he coveted, the bank accounts he planned to drain. None of it belonged to him anymore. Not legally, not morally, not even conceptually. I was no longer the aging mother waiting to be handled. I was the architect of my own escape, and I had just laid the final cornerstone. I stood in front of the mirror in Victor's apartment, hardly recognizing the woman staring back. My silver hair had been cut into a sleek, precise bob. The soft curls Patrick insisted made me look maternal were gone. In their place was a line that sharpened my face, framed my eyes, and made me look like someone who had never been small. The dress was crimson bold without being loud. It hugged my shoulders and fell in clean lines to the floor. It didn't shimmer or sparkle. It commanded. It said I was not finished. I was not invisible. Victor stood behind me and adjusted the hem. He said nothing, but his eyes said everything. He had helped me rehearse my entrance for days. Every movement is choreographed to show control, not fragility. Every breath was timed to mask the trembling that still visited me when I was tired. Inside, I was afraid. My heart beat faster than I liked. Not from exertion, but from the weight of what I was about to do. I couldn't afford a single misstep. I had spent months pretending to fall apart. Tonight, I had to show the opposite. Nia helped me into the car and squeezed my hand once before closing the door. Her confidence gave me strength. Victor and I rode in silence, the kind that only long-trusted allies can share. The streets passed like shadows, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I would make it through the evening without breaking. We arrived 15 minutes after the guests, just as planned. I waited in the car until the maitre d' confirmed that everyone was seated, and Patrick was beginning to wonder. The timing had to be exact. As we stepped through the doorway, a hush fell over the room. Heads turned, glasses paused mid-air. I walked slowly, deliberately, my heels clicking against the polished floor with each step. My spine straight, my eyes steady. The woman they thought they'd buried in fog had returned. Patrick stood frozen near the head table. Danielle's expression cracked first, her jaw tightening around a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I nodded at them, calm and cool. "Thank you for arranging such a beautiful evening." I watched the ripple of confusion move through the crowd. They were trying to make sense of the image before them, trying to reconcile the fading matriarch they'd pitied with the woman in red, who now took her place at the center of the room. Every step I took felt like a reclaiming of space, of identity, of voice. And though my hands trembled slightly beneath the fabric of my sleeve, my presence never wavered. Because this wasn't just a dinner. It was the opening act of something far more important. The stage was set, and I was finally ready to speak. Dinner had just reached the main course, when Patrick stood and tapped his glass. The room quieted, anticipating another carefully scripted speech. He smiled at the crowd, then at me, with the confidence of someone who believed the night belonged to him. He announced his new position with Westfield Development, a promotion he said was built on the legacy I had given him. He raised a toast to the future, to family, to progress. Guests clapped, some smiling politely, others distracted by the tension in the air they couldn't yet explain. I waited until the applause faded, then rose from my seat. Slowly, deliberately. The room stilled again. I thanked everyone for coming. Then I said I had an announcement of my own. I spoke of legacy, of truth, of what it really means to pass something down. I said I had spent the last 6 months preparing for this evening, not as a celebration, but as a reckoning. Behind me, Celeste stood. Next to her, Elizabeth, a state prosecutor who had taken an interest in my case. Their presence sent ripples across the tables. I handed each guest a sealed envelope. Inside were portfolios detailing the creation of the Hartman Fund, the transfer of assets and documented evidence of financial abuse and medical interference. Patrick laughed, a short, nervous sound. He tried to dismiss it as confusion, stress, maybe even dementia. But Elizabeth stepped forward and stated clearly that a formal investigation was underway, that the documents were real, that the testimonies were recorded, that the surveillance was already in their hands. Rebecca turned white. She stood and muttered something about needing air, but an officer in plain clothes was already at the door. Celeste read a statement. confirming that the house and all assets had been transferred to a legal entity they could no longer touch. Patrick's face collapsed, first into disbelief, then into panic. He turned to me and whispered that we could talk about this, that I was making a mistake, that this was family. I looked at him and said the words I'd rehearsed in the dark for weeks. "You tried to kill me?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. The betrayal was complete, and so was my exposure of it. Guests began to leave quietly, uncertain where to place their eyes. But the ones who mattered, the fund directors, the prosecutors, the donors, they stayed. They stood by me. I sat back down as Rebecca clutched her purse like it held salvation. Patrick slumped in his chair, the mask finally gone. In that moment, I didn't just reclaim my name or my legacy. I reclaimed my power. And in full view of everyone who had ever doubted me, I made sure the truth was louder than the lie. The spring sun poured through the wide front windows of my former home, now buzzing with the laughter and footsteps of people too young to remember my name from the gallery years. The brass plaque by the door read, "The Hartman Foundation for Emerging Artists," and every time I passed it, something inside me loosened. Not sadness, not triumph. Something gentler, a kind of quiet release. 1 year had passed since that night at the dinner, since I said aloud what had once felt unspeakable, since I stepped out of survival and into something new. The house still looked like mine, but it sounded different now. Conversations layered over each other in multiple accents, brushes clattered on pallets, and someone always seemed to be humming. We kept the structure intact. I insisted on it. The studio was now a shared workspace. The dining room had become a small lecture hall, and the upstairs bedrooms housed the first class of resident artists. I had worried they might treat the place like a shrine or a relic, but they didn't. They made it live again. On my desk in the office that used to be Patrick's childhood room, there was a letter, unopened. I had recognized the handwriting immediately. It came from a federal prison upstate. I hadn't read it, and I didn't intend to. Some truths don't need more pages. The tremors still came mostly when I was tired. Some nights I would lose a word mid-sentence and sit quietly until it returned. But Dr. Hughes said my recovery was ahead of schedule. Nia made sure I ate properly, rested when I needed, and stayed present in the life I was rebuilding. Victor visited often, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with silence. We didn't speak much about the past anymore. It had shrunk behind us like a town you leave and only glimpse in your rearview mirror. We were building something now, a gallery wing, a new mentorship program, a curriculum for business skills to help young artists protect their futures. The press had covered the story well enough. Not scandalized, not sensational, just thorough. The foundation's launch made headlines. The convictions made footnotes. That was how I wanted it. On the anniversary of the confrontation, we held a small event in the garden. Nothing elaborate, just alumni, donors, neighbors. I gave a short speech. I kept it simple. I said this house had been many things: a home, a trap, a courtroom, and now a beginning. After the crowd drifted inside for wine and conversation, I stayed out back alone. The sculpture near the fountain, a piece I started years ago but never finished, stood tall and rough. One of the students had asked if they could sand it down, complete it. I told them no. Some things are meant to remain unfinished. I thought back to the early days of recovery, the nausea from withdrawal. The fog is slowly lifting. The ache of knowing my own child had once measured my life in property and accounts. But none of that had followed me here. What remained was purpose, real and solid. In the hallway just outside the studio, we hung a quote carved into reclaimed wood. It said, "What you build is not who you are. What you protect, what you preserve, what you pass on, that is your legacy." When I saw students reading it, tracing the letters with their fingers, I knew it had all been worth it. Every hour of pretending. Every pill was tucked beneath my tongue. Every step from the edge back to something whole. I had once feared I would die in silence, dismissed and forgotten. Instead, I stood in the garden of a home reborn, and watched a new generation make space for their voices. No one here asked me to be a symbol. They asked for advice, for stories, for clay, for patience. They gave more than they took. And in return, I gave them everything that had once been nearly stolen from me. The house was no longer mine, but it had never felt more like home, and that was enough.